Hello and welcome. My name is Rob Montgomery, and I'm coming to you live from the Smart Film School in Berlin, Germany, where we're going to be talking today with someone who is like a keynote speaker for a Mojo workshop event. We're going to be talking with Chrisopher Cohen, this Chief Technical Officer of, guess what, Filmic Pro. Filmic Pro, you know, the app that gives you a professional video camera in your smartphone, whether it's Android or iPhone. And today, on iPhone, you could shoot in ProRes. And so I've invited Chris to kind of fill us in, let us know what works, what doesn't, what we can expect with Filmic Pro and ProRes on the latest iPhone Pro models. So Chris, if you're there, he's joining us from, I think it's Seattle. So Chris, come onto the stage and share with us a little bit about some of the technical requirements for Filmic Pro and how it can make a difference with what's going on. Are you there?
Hey.
Yeah, there he is. Chimed in. Oh, you're in living Technicolor.
Thanks for having me.
What a cool look, man. That looks really cool. I'm like in Randy Rainbow world, and you're like, I don't know, in the 1950s or something.
There's an inside joke at Filmic that I secretly hate color. I tend to do all of my image processing in monochrome first, and when I do interface design, I always do it in monochrome as well. I don't actually hate color, but I'm willing to feed into that stereotype.
It's okay. I like it. You're pushing out a good vibe. You know, I started as a visual storyteller with black and white film, so it's completely natural to me what you're saying, and that journey has led me here to talking to you about, you know, high-end filmmaking with cameras that a lot of us have in our pockets, and being able to get big stories out of small cameras is what I'm all about as well. So I'd like it, you know, we've got ProRes to talk about. The Double Take app, that's another app from Filmic Pro that I like to show a lot with journalists and people making any kind of explanatory types of videos. Really, really useful. I just talked with a lecturer at the World Wildlife Foundation here in Germany, and they were really blown away by that app. Didn't know about it. And of course, I always show my bicycle filming, the news from the bicycle lane stuff. And so lots been going on with Filmic. You've got some other things like the add-on with the cinematographer's kit, which I noticed doesn't work in ProRes, so you'll have to ask us, tell us a little about that if that's coming. And also, if you know, the looks, you've also got film looks that are also like an upgrade, and you can also share a little bit about that. But you know, I think people think, well, I had a student last week who's like, which phone should I get, Rob? Should I get the new phone, iPhone 13 Pro, so I can film in ProRes? And this is before I started to really process what this was going to mean. I was like, oh, you probably don't need that for Mojo. I mean, because I'm just like, you say ProRes and you're like, huge files you're going to be creating on your device. And so the first thing is like, no, it's probably not the right workflow. But for the documentaries that you're going to enter in the Mojo Awards, absolutely, it's going to give you the best stuff when we project it on the silver screen and, you know, in Perugia. But for everyday work, and then I was like, as usual, I started the inverse of that thinking. I was like, well, why can't I use ProRes for Mojo? And then I realized what you did was put in for the 4 modes of 422 ProRes. And so I'd like you to kind of walk us through that, and maybe there is a mode for Mojo. I think I'm still researching, I'm still discovering, but I'm just kind of blown away by a lot of the night photography that I've been able to do, even handheld. It just wasn't possible before. So I'll gladly step away from the stage and let you kind of fill us in, and you can go on a deep dive and geek out on this stuff as much as you want, because I think there's a lot of mystery, confusion, and anything we can do to guide people to making the right kind of setups for whatever kind of scenes they need to film would be really helpful. So thanks.
Okay, I have a short presentation that I can go through, a keynote. It's just an overview of the contrast really between group of pictures encoding and ProRes. Time would fail me to actually go do a deep dive on each feature of of the commonalities and the differences between the two. But I think it would be helpful just so that we can be using the same language to understand what we're talking about here. So I'm going to go and share my screen. And I apologize if my voice is not up to snuff. I am recovering from an illness right now. All right. Let me play. All right, Rob, can you see this?
Yes, it looks great. Thanks so much. It says CODECS, and codec means compression, decompression. That's what I know about
All
codecs.
right. The point of this is to go over the what a codec is on a very high level, and then to go over the differences between GOP and all intra-codecs, and I will explain what those are later. A lot of people don't think this is necessary to know, and it wasn't, to be honest, in the past. Because iPhone and Android phones, they didn't offer a lot of options. Really, you were shooting variations of very basic consumer level GOP codecs, and you would usually be given one option. That has changed radically over the past couple of years, and now we are awash with all kinds of options. Depending on what platform you're using, you can choose up to 3 or 4 codec schemes. You can choose 4 levels of compression. You can choose different subsamplings, different bit depths. What does it all mean? We'll go into that. All right. So first of all, let's talk about what a codec is at a very high level. And the point of this presentation is not to overwhelm the novice with techno babble. We're going to do a follow-up Q&A after this short presentation, and Rob can maybe drill down on some things that I didn't go into enough detail on. But at a high level, a codec is, it compresses and decompresses digital video using software or hardware. On a phone, that typically is not done in software. It's done in hardware through hardware acceleration. In the context of video compression, a codec is a synthesis of encoder and decoder. So on your phone, everything, the piece of silicon that's powering the show is called a SoC, or system on a chip. And there's all kinds of compute complexes on this SoC. There's a complex for doing general compute, which is your CPUs. There's your GPU cluster. There's your ML cluster. But there's also a part of a piece of silicon on that SoC, and its only job is to encode and decode photos and video, and also do some audio signal processing as well. Without this piece of silicon, mobile videography as we know it just wouldn't be possible, and I'm grateful for it. With an encoder being a device only that compresses, and a decoder being a device that decompresses. So it's very simple. This little encoder on the SoC, its only job in life is to compress and decompress. And we use this all the time, whether we realize it or not. If you're doing a video call, for instance, it's not the CPU that's handling the compression and decompression. That would not be tenable. A CPU, believe it or not, is actually pretty lousy at video compression, decompression. And if the CPU was handling all of that, everything from just taking photos that wouldn't take a minute to compress, or taking short videos of your kids, your dogs playing in a field, or just doing a video conference, none of that would be possible, or at least it wouldn't be a pleasant user experience. So we're grateful for these encoders and decoders. They started out very simple, but as the years went by, they became more and more sophisticated and more configurable. Now, most codecs are lossy. A lossy codec is one that sacrifices video quality in order to compactify, I spelled that wrong, the encoded file size. So there's always a compromise between quality and size. And depending on the encoding scheme and the strategy that the codec takes, that there's going to be a little horse trading there in terms of what attributes you're willing to preserve and what attributes you're willing to lose. Many codecs, they prioritize what's called midtone and upper midtone detail, and they will apply greater compression to darker areas of the screen. And the justification for this is very understandable, because you're not, that's not what you're looking at, right? So these codecs are designed to sacrifice quality in reasonable parts of the screen. They're also designed, in many cases, depending on the kind of codec, to sacrifice quality of objects that are in motion. And the reason for that is many times the object in motion is blurring anyway, or it's not still enough, long enough for you to actually see that high frequency detail. So the codec is more concerned with still and static images because that's where your eye can dwell. All of these compromises have been very intelligently made, and you won't notice, or at least you're not supposed to notice them in many cases. However, there are visual artifacts in all codecs. You just need to know where to look. The most popular video format is H.264, also known as HEVC, but that's quickly being supplanted by H.265 or HEVC. Next item. So here's some common codecs. I don't need to go through all of them, but they break down broadly into two categories. They actually subdivide further, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. They break down into group of picture encoding and all intra encoding. And the difference between group of picture encoding and all intra encoding is it's somewhat abstract, but group of picture encoding is exactly what it sounds like. It's a group of pictures. You have these keyframes, and in between keyframes, you're going to have several frames that are not full frames, but they're fragments. And the group of picture encoding basically reconstructs the image from those fragments. All intra, however, encodes the video. Each individual video frame is recorded discretely, which means it's basically like a collection of photos. And as you can imagine, the quality potential for all intra is much higher, but the compromise there is all intra files are dramatically larger in size. And that's why we don't really use these. Now, I want to talk about group of pictures encoding for a moment. Group of pictures encoding is an amazing innovation. And without group of pictures encoding, services like Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, they just wouldn't be able to deliver their content. You can get a very high quality image out of a GOP codec. It's extraordinary. It's really revolutionized how we consume content, how we produce content. However, it's complicated, and this is just a very simple diagram of what a generic group of pictures encoding codec is doing. And you can see, I'm not going to go through all of these different stages, but you can see there's recursion built in here. There's inverse quantization. It's very complicated, and without specialized acceleration hardware, it's not possible. You cannot do this on the CPU in real time. There are some very real disadvantages to this, and we're going to go over that later. But I want to contrast a group of pictures encoding diagram with a all intra encoding diagram. Now remember, this diagram is this more or less the same structure that all of your consumer codecs would use. So we're talking H.264, MPEG-4, HEVC, all of them use a very similar scheme. If we go to all intra encoding, we see that diagram simplifies dramatically. There's just not much going on. And this is somewhat counterintuitive. A lot of people expect that these all intra professional codecs to be even more complex and to be doing even spookier things. But the truth is they're actually manipulating the image less. There's less going on. And that's the reason why they offer higher quality. They're better at the delta E tests. They're better with high frequency detail. They're better with motion cohesion. And the simple reason why that is so is because they're just adulterating the image less. All right. So moving on, we want to go into the pros and cons of ProRes. ProRes is the codec that Filmic Pro and Apple just kind of released support for recently. And it's getting a lot of attention. But these pros and be applied to most all intra encoding schemes, with the exception of some wavelet raw all intra codecs. Now, in the pros, undeniably, it's a high-quality codec. You can edit on unaccelerated hardware, number 2. That's interesting. So again, this is bucking expectations just very slightly. A lot of people think that ProRes requires exotic encoders and decoders to work. HEVC is a great example. Many people have had a terrible experience with HEVC because if they're trying to edit it or transcode it on a device, on a laptop or an iPad or something, a tablet that does not have that HEVC encoder, it's going to be a terrible experience. It's going to be a terrible experience in the edit process, and it's going to be a terrible experience in the export and transcode process. ProRes, on the other hand, if we go back and we think on how simple that encoder diagram is, ProRes actually does lend itself to being encoded and decoded on the CPU with ease. You can and probably should edit ProRes with acceleration hardware, but the cool thing is you don't need to. You don't need to. You can work with ProRes on a computer that has no ProRes acceleration hardware at all, and it will still be usable, whereas HEVC will struggle. 3, high bit depth, and this is important. You can shoot ProRes can be used up to between 10 and 16 bit bit depth, and that's helpful. Just to explain what bit depth is, essentially, it's just how many shades in your gradient you can have. Essentially, think of it as gradients would be like skies, and skin would be the most common gradients. Low bit depth video, like 8-bit depth, they're only able to encode 255 or 256 shades of a specific color range, and that means that under some circumstances you can get what's called striping or posterization. I don't want to go into crazy detail here, but the higher the bit depth, the more shades that you have, and they tend to increase exponentially. So as professional videographers, we want to shoot at minimum 10-bit if possible. ProRes also has a low delta E, which means that when you compare a ProRes video frame to the raw version of that frame, it means that the delta between the two is very low. The difference, that is. That is not the case with a group of pictures encoders like HEVC and H.264. Those delta E's are not favorable at all. High spatial frequency detail. This one, to put that one simply, your hair is what would be considered high frequency detail. Blades of grass, high frequency detail. The texture in fabric would also be considered high frequency detail. Group of pictures encoders like HEVC and H.264 are marvelous general purpose consumer codecs. However, they're pretty lousy at high frequency detail. ProRes and other all-intra codecs, they excel at this. They can preserve extremely fine, nuanced detail just because they don't have to reconstruct the frames from between keyframe intervals. 6, and the subsampling is high. Subsampling, I don't want to go too deep on this because I feel like an entire presentation could be dedicated to subsampling. But at a very high level, subsampling is just the idea that luminance, that is the black and white information, and chrominance, which is your color information, can be archived at different resolutions. And typically in consumer codecs, the luminance information is the highest possible resolution, and the chrominance information is the color information is a lower resolution. It's typically half or 1/4 the resolution of the Luma channel. And you might think to yourself, well, if the color resolution is 1/4 the resolution of the luminance information, why don't I notice that? Well, the reason why is because the human visual system is just better at picking up luminance information than it is chrominance information. So that's just one of those reasonable, I say reasonable compromises that people who design codecs have made. However, with ProRes, you can shoot at higher subsampling rates. That is to say that there's more color information in the image than there is typically on consumer codecs like HEVC and H.264, which can both do 10-bit video, by the way. However, on mobile phones and mobile video, in the context of mobile videography, typically they don't. So ProRes, you have that high quality chrome information. There are some cons, though, and one of the big cons of ProRes is the files are large. At the smallest size, ProRes proxy is going to be 1.25 times the size of the largest encoding scheme you're going to get on Filmic Pro. So they're big. So when you're shooting ProRes, you have to account for that. Transcoding is inefficient. So this is kind of counterintuitive, I suppose. But while you can edit with ProRes nicely, you get a nice NLE experience. The export is going to be difficult unless you have a lot of free space, a large amount of RAM. You just need the machine to support that. 3, spotty NLE support, nonlinear editor. Some nonlinear editors don't handle ProRes very well, or they require acceleration. But that the same is also true with HEVC even still. So HEVC, I'm talking about HEVC specifically here in this pros and cons list because it is probably the most popular codec now for video on mobile. But this could apply to all group of pictures encoders. Pros, the quality is moderate. The quality is moderate, and I don't mean that as any disrespect to HEVC. It's doing a lot of, it's yielding a lot of quality for very modest file size requirements. So that's good. I put that in the pros quality column. The files are very compact with HEVC. Again, this has to do with how it encodes video. It reconstructs them from fragments. 3, wide hardware acceleration support on newer devices only. There is a huge divide between somebody editing an HEVC video on a laptop that was made in the last 2 years and with somebody who's editing HEVC on a laptop that's 5 years old or older. And it's not because the newer devices are faster per se, but they have specialized hardware acceleration, usually built into the processor or separate accelerator chip or something like that, or something built into the discrete graphics card. Now, modern hardware, whether you're dealing with an Apple SoC or you're using with like an Intel SoC or maybe an accelerator from AMD or Intel or NVIDIA, they're going to have HEVC acceleration. So if your workflow is to work with HEVC and you have a relatively modern machine, you're going to be fine. This is going to be okay. So I'm putting this in the pros column. On new devices, there is hardware acceleration available. Bit depth is moderate. Again, you can shoot typically most HEVC codecs on mobile at least are 8-bit only, but there are some devices that support 10-bit encoding, and that's great. That's great. That's more shades of gray, to more gradient expression. Now, in the cons, we have poor temporal cohesion, and that's just a fancy word for saying that things are in motion, things are not static. They tend to break down in terms of detail, and this is just the innate nature of GOP encoders. That's just how they are. Objects in motion tend to have less detail. 2, the transcodes are slow. Even with hardware acceleration, HEVC hasn't really been the fastest. So if you have an HEVC file in your NLE and you want to export it as a different format, you want to export it as MPEG-2, say, it's going to take a fair amount of time. Hardware acceleration is required, so this is kind of a counterpoint to number 3 on the pro side. You can't edit HEVC without hardware acceleration. You can have the beefiest workstation imaginable, but somewhere in that block of silicon and aluminum, you really need to have HEVC hardware acceleration. Otherwise, you're going to have a bad go of it. And the subsampling is typically low. HEVC can do higher subsampling, or that is to say, higher color resolution, but typically on consumer mirrorless cameras, you're limited at the high end to 422. So that's fine. Typically low-ish bit rate. Though, to be fair, HEVC doesn't really need extraordinarily high bit rates. And with HEVC in particular, the higher the bit rate goes, you kind of have a case of diminishing returns. So the quality difference between HEVC that's encoding at 90 megabits per second and HEVC that's encoding at 130 megabits per second, it's there. It's just harder to see. So you have this diminishing returns curve with HEVC bit rates. And that is my presentation, kind of a general overview of let me turn this off, the difference between all intra and group of pictures encoding. Again, I could go into extraordinary detail on any one of those items, and we would be here all day. But rather than doing that, I want to give you kind of a general overview and then open it up for any kind of questions or give you an opportunity, Rob, to drill down on specific areas.
So thank you so much for sparing us no detail. I asked you to give us a really chief technical officer's lay of the land and kind of explain that these things have always been interrelated. And that's what I've always had to explain to people when I'm training them on smartphone videos. Why does my Android not do what an iPhone does? And for a long time, it was the answer. Well, look, Apple's been doing pro video for 25 years. They integrate the silicon and the code at the atomic level, at the molecular or the subatomic level. That's the easiest way I could layman to say is like, because, well, and they own some of those patents and they can do that. And they keep, because what you're saying, this is the only phone that can do ProRes because it has a chip. Is that right?
That's right.
A15 Bionic. So again, like what you're talking about, some types of compression can only be done with hardware. Some types of coding can only be done if that chip is there. So people who are wondering, why can't I get ProRes on my older iPhone? You don't have the chip. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Now, technically, they do have some ProRes encoding support on the encoders of legacy devices, but they're not in a state that would make it a good experience. So really, the complete package is on the latest generation of iPhones. And I wouldn't recommend a ProRes workflow on anything but the latest generation of phones. Also, it's not just the fact that the encoder is there. The camera system has to support ProRes as well. You need to have, and I didn't go into this in the presentation, but you need pixel buffers delivered with the right subsampling, the right bit depth, the right color primaries, the intrinsics matrix. All of that stuff needs to support ProRes. So it's not just the encoder. There's a complete image processing chain that needs to be there. And the fact that a phone can do this, I mean, to me, it's mind-blowing. And I'm deep in this field, but it's really an engineering marvel that they've been able to build that complete image processing chain in an iPhone. And I'm just thrilled to see where it's going to go from here.
It is, and especially when you combine the fact that the camera systems have gotten better, that they've got this mechanical stabilization, this isolation, that you kind of think of like, what does that mean? And it's like, so people can see what we're talking about here, because not many people have the iPhone 13 Pro or Pro Max. I'm just walking down and I'm filming. I'm just scrubbing slowly here. By the way, one of the great nonlinear editors that support ProRes is LumaFusion. So here I'm showing. So that's completely mobile workflow. Just look at these shots. This is, I can show you what I mean. I can just, zoom right in on that greatly. And it just holds all that detail. Like you said,
Objects
I was just blown away.
Yeah.
Blown away. Look, I'm coming in 250. I could go, let's go right to 300. Die Hackischer Hoof, it's right there. Die Hackische Hufe, Puma. I can read everything. H&M. It's all right there. It's unbelievable. Like you said, it's blowing me away as I'm just making my first tests and going through those different modes of, you said, and I was just looking also what I can do in LumaFusion is get the metadata, right? So you can look at that clip and say, okay, what's going on there? And it'll tell you it's Apple ProRes 422 proxy. It's in the Rec 709 color space. It says 12-bit in parentheses, but you say it's really 10-bit video in a 12-bit container. And it's written at 146.1 megabits per second, which was way beyond what we could ever do before with just the default, Filmic Extreme, I think, right? Or was Filmic Extreme like 100 megabits per second, or was it higher than that? I'm not
Filmic
sure. But
Extreme. So these, all of these codecs are variable bit, right? So depending on what's in the scene, they're going to consume more disk space. It could go as high as 135 megabits per second in some situations, but that's not laminar. That's going to contract and that's going to expand depending on what's being encoded.
Yeah, and I'm obviously making all my examples at 4K and at 24 frames per second. I think those are also part of the calculus there in terms of the file size that you're going to get. But I found that I could film at night suddenly where I couldn't before. I mean, I could film at night without having a lot of noise in there at a lower ISO, even up to 170 on the ISO or 300 on the ISO, and still holding the image is not breaking up, like you said. I mean, that's
ProRes doesn't target lower midtones and shadows the same way that HEVC and H.264 do. Like I said in the prezo, or maybe before, H.264 and all those modern GOP encoders, they try to preserve detail in upper midtones, but the shadows, the root sector of the RGB cube, they have no problem sacrificing that detail. Different with all intro encoders. The all intro encoders are equal opportunity pixel purists, right? They don't discriminate between high key and low key pixels, so you can shoot low light with ProRes, and it's not going to adulterate that information, thinking that it's dispensable. The nice thing about that is you can intentionally underexpose if you want to preserve highlight information, and then in post you can lift it up slightly. Don't go crazy with it, obviously, but the information is there, and ProRes did capture it, and it's one of those codecs I just love to be surprised by, because I can go into a scene that's just amazingly dark, and in
like
post I can lift it by a stop or two, and the data just comes back to life.
Well, let's try that. Let's try that. I'm just in here, and I've got a very dark scene. And actually, I liked the Batman quality of this scene. I don't know if I really want to pull out the shadows, because you're peeking into the cars. You're seeing the riders or non-riders here. You're seeing through the train. I like the darkness, but the thing that me as a nonfiction filmmaker is like, that's exactly how it looked to my eye. There's not much different. I know that my human eye has a few more stops than even this latest phone, but it just looked authentic, and it looked like it looked. It didn't drop out so much. But like you're saying, you could go in there and work on the highlights or the shadows or on the shadow amount, but there's only this one slider here that we have. But I could even open that up a little bit more. And it's still it's like I said, it's not losing it. It's not, I've already, if we zoom in on that, it's just holding all the detail. You can read that frigging sign. Pharmacy, and the barbecue and everything in there. Just amazing stuff. Let's just go back a little. So the A15 Bionic, that's what makes ProRes happen on the 13, and so probably that's going to be on every model of phone in the future. So ProRes is now here to stay, probably in the Apple universe. The Apple version of ProRes, at least the first version that came out with 15.1, is only the HQ, the super high megabits. Is this what you're talking about with higher subsampling rates? Is that some of the differences between L2, 422 proxy and HQ? Or what is the real?
It's not the subsampling at all. It's just the encoding. So ProRes works by breaking the image up into these macro blocks, kind of like how JPEG encoding works the same way, right? You divide the scene into macro blocks and then you apply your compression, right? So the macro blocks are just smaller on HQ and the compression is less. Now, that said, if you hold, if you do pixel peeping and you compare proxy with HQ, yes, there will be a difference if you zoom in, but the difference will not be as extraordinary as you think, especially considering how much larger those file sizes are. But no, there is no difference with the chroma subsampling. The quality of the chroma information is the same on proxy and HQ.
Yeah, that's what I was struggling to find a difference, because the first scenes I'd filmed was a breaking news scene, and I had just got it on the out of my pod. I just got the phone and I got the Filmic update, and I just said, "Oh, I found out where to find it. Let's go into ProRes." And then it's, I didn't realize there were four levels of it and what all that meant. So that was a lot of fun, because it was breaking news scene. It was a police action. There were drunk hooligans from the Netherlands for a soccer match, and they were lighting off pyrotechnics in this same location. So I got a real test, but HQ, and that's where I was like, okay. Then I was like, okay, so that I expect HQ is going to be the best. So of course, when I go to LT, it's going to just all break up and go to, and it didn't, and it didn't.
No.
That was cool.
Yeah, was cool. I have a hard time telling the difference, to be honest, between LT and HQ. Just visually, it's very challenging. Yeah. You have to zoom in to hard edges and transitions to even begin to see a difference. I personally, for my everyday shooting, I go with proxy. I'm perfectly happy with it. I use proxy for everything. Now, I do think there's a place for HQ. I think if you're doing work like chroma key, for instance, where the edges, you don't want any artifacting on your transitions at all. So for shooting situations like that, very specific workflows where you need as much image from the virginal picture frame as possible, by all means, go with HQ. But for everything else, it's I don't want to say a waste because that diminishes it. It's an extraordinary accomplishment that we even have. But
outrageous, though.
Right tool for the right job.
6 gigabits a minute, right? So something like that in HQ, you'll fill up your phone fast. So
quite.
Yeah. What else did you say? Oh, some cool terms. The low delta, motion cohesion. That I noticed also right away going to ProRes. Whenever I did a camera move, and I show this in my demo tutorial, where I just do a pan move to the singer, and it looked a lot better. But looked a lot different. That's what you mean by motion cohesion. That's the result we're getting.
Yeah, motion. Yeah, absolutely. With group of picture encoding, everything that's in motion breaks apart because it has to be reconstructed between the span of 2 keyframes. So static images will be higher detail, and objects in motion will just break apart, and that's typically fine. However, if you're doing a specific kind of shooting where you're not doing real-time shooting, say you're capturing at 30 and you want to play it back at, say, 24, for instance, you want to add a slight off speed to it, then you can run into some problems, and those problems are enforced by the codec, not necessarily by the camera system itself. So that motion cohesion, maintaining detail in motion is important. It's also important too if you want to pull stills from your video. And I know many people who do that, especially in journalism, where they'll be out and they'll be shooting something and they need to pull still. And they need to publish that on a blog or something immediately.
We got
with HEVC encoding, it's depending on the still you pull, it's going to be a blurry mess. But with ProRes, each individual frame is recorded discreetly, and you can pull any frame you want. They're all keyframes.
Just like movies were when they were on celluloid, a frame is a frame. It's everything old is new again. And ProRes isn't new. That's the thing. It's right. We talked about this. This was built by Apple 15 years ago or 16 years ago as a way for under accelerated hardware to be able to edit high quality footage. And so it became the delivery format for broadcasts, for commercials, and
it was very controversial back in the day. back in the primordial age, because ProRes, unlike other raw or nominally compressed video files, it didn't require much to decode. And that's, like you said, that was the entire objective behind ProRes, to shoot a file and then to bring it into hardware of that day. I mean, imagine editing video on a PC from 15 years ago. Well, with ProRes, it was possible, right?
Yeah.
Because it didn't really, uh, it didn't have a great compute cost to actually work through. But Apple got a lot of flack for it from hardware manufacturers, because that cost was shifted away from the consumer, but onto the hardware manufacturer, that where ProRes encoding itself on the hardware was extremely difficult, very bandwidth intensive, requiring expensive ASICs and FPGAs. And it made a lot of people deeply unhappy that that was what Apple had chosen, but it turned out to be the right choice over time.
Yeah, as it often is with Apple, they will make those sometimes controversial choices. I hope, like, they took away my microphone jack here. I'm not happy about that. I'm not seeing the wisdom there. But we make do with other ways to just make sure the batteries are really charged. So because usually that's a power you got to either do. If I'm doing live stream, I'm going to have power, or I'm going to have a microphone. But now we can get MagSafe powering, so we can go in and put in our little lightning microphone, right? So, ProRes doesn't have anything to do with the audio, does it? Or I didn't even think to ask that until I put this microphone out. It's just handling the video. So
That's
what's happening in the audio? So when I'm filming in ProRes, the audio is handled separately, however I choose in the settings. Is that right?
Yeah, you get the same options that you have with group of pictures encoding. There's no arbitrary limitations that are being imposed.
Yeah, right. So we're looking at, you can see we're looking here. So, and by the way, if you're wondering where this is, folks, it's under resolution. And under resolution 4K, and then I'm in proxy. There's LT, there's 422, and there's 422 HQ. ProRes 709 information. It's a variable bitrate 422 video compression format. Okay. But I could go, I didn't see this. I have different ProRes 2020. What are these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you have an HDR workflow and HDR publishing is important to you, it may be advantageous to record as ProRes BT 2020. And that will allow you to drop it into, like, say, DaVinci Resolve or Final Cut, and actually build an HDR file from ProRes. So I would say for most people, it's not necessary to work with ProRes 2020.
So the 2020, okay, supports people. Okay, so that would have thrown me. ProRes 709, that's what I've been showing. That's mainly what we've been talking about. This Rec 709 or ProRes 709 is kind of the standard color space, the way that we see videos normally looking when they're not trying to be hyper real HDR or Dolby Vision things, right?
Absolutely.
Like I said that style works for a lot of what we're doing in mobile journalism and documentary film. We want things to be real and genuine and authentic and connect in a relatable way. But if you're doing some kind of filmmaking that's not, then you might be looking to those HDR kind of experiences, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell where HDR is going to go from here. I would say 2 years ago, the situation with HDR was a mess, right? You had TVs that were abiding different HDR standards, and the major streaming platforms didn't support HDR in any meaningful way. That's changed dramatically, and in actually a surprisingly fast way. We've seen HDR start to be adopted. So I would not close the book on HDR. I think it's going to become increasingly important over the next 10 years, and I think there's going to come a day when that is primarily what we record and consume, but we're not there yet. And for most people, I would say stick to Rec 709. It's going to do a few different things for you. It's going to allow you to do direct publishing. It's also going to allow you to have maximal compatibility with nonlinear editors. Not all nonlinear editors handle or have the same kind of color space management. They'll all have their own quirks. And if you just want to avoid headaches across the board, I would just stick with Rec 709.
Yeah, I agree with you. What I'm teaching people is I want them to be, because a lot of what they're filming is not only news, it becomes the historical artifact that becomes referred to later on. It's like, I want you to have durable documentations, of the things that you're filming, that the videos, the stories, they should be durable, not just temporal and ephemeral. And so Rec 709 kind of fits that philosophy right now. I mean, like I said, I'm definitely willing for radical inversions of my thinking, but right now my experiences with HDR has just been, it's just too much. Maybe that's just because
Yeah, and
I
again,
yeah,
we need to allow that space to evolve on its own. I don't know where it's going to go from here. It looks like Dolby Vision is becoming the standard for HDR video, but that may not be the case forever. The HDR10 specs are updated every 2 to 3 years now, and they're getting better and better all the time. So I think there's a quiet format war happening behind the scenes, similar
okay.
to HD DVD and Blu-ray and Betamax versus VHS. So it's not as public as those format wars were, but there is a format war going on, and we don't know where the dust is going to settle right now. However, I do think that's going to get sorted at some point, and HDR video is going to become far normal. I do think, though, adopting a standard before the standard is adopted is extremely risky. I don't know if you remember, like, the Wild West of the early 2000s, where there were just dozens of competing video compression schemes.
Well, the audio compressions, there was real audio
Hmm.
players and all this stuff. Do you remember before?
Oh yeah,
And
definitely.
yeah, everyone wanted their own proprietary, had their patented thing they wanted to hook you onto. And yeah, I do remember.
Well, I mean, the consequence of that was very real. If you were archiving video back then and you were using an exotic audio codec or an exotic video codec because it saved 20% on your 80 gigabyte hard drive, and you tried to access that video 30 years later, I don't even know if you'll be able to do it. Um, I know that there are, like, Handbrake, for instance, has a really long list of legacy codecs that they support, but they do drop codecs too. There's some media that is going to get stranded. So there's wisdom to, like you said, choosing to um, think in terms of the durability of the archive that you're making.
Yeah, and I'm gonna switch now to my Mac. Can you see my Mac? I'm gonna
Hmm.
lose me because I'm not important. But what you're looking at here is HDV footage that I shot 10 years ago in Hong Kong, and it's incredible. It still holds up. It's 1440 by 1080, which is that's what it recorded it at, but it comes out as 16 by 9 somehow. And so, not losing that footage, I have no way. I don't even know where the power supply for this thing is, but I still have all my tapes. I still
Oh
have
wow!
all those original tapes. Yeah, because I'm a journalist and we have
Right.
to archive. So there's disciplines here. Everything's taped, it's named, it's dated. I ingested everything right away, but that was FireWire over, and those are the versions I've got there. I don't think those are ProRes. They say MPEG-2 if I go and get information on them. That's what's interesting. So,
MPEG 2 was great. It was a less
yeah,
sophisticated codec than its successors, but there was a lot going for it in the sense
it
that
was
it was
1080 and
adulterating the image
it was
less.
interlaced. It was interlaced as well. It wasn't even
Hmm.
progressive, which is very TV.
Very
They like,
TV, yeah.
they like to have interlaced. I can't even.
I think
That's a whole other presentation.
that legacy footage is getting a second lease on life, I think, because we have modern technologies where we're doing temporal noise reduction. Great
Yeah,
anti-interlacing tech is available now, and
well,
even
the
AI
audio
super
again.
sampling. We
Yeah,
can, so if you just did the base thing of recording it in a codec that has durability that you can access 20 years later, then you can do something with that video.
and thankfully I did that with my video, so I can show people. And I wanted to thank you again for joining us. We've been on for an hour already, and like you said, you're recovering from something, and you probably need to get your rest. And we'll probably need to go find a beer garden here in Berlin pretty soon too, as the weekend's starting. Chris, thanks so much for sharing. and we could talk again. And hopefully we will talk again about new stuff coming out with Filmic Pro.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
Pleasure.
Bye.